The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. Welcome to the Salty Seaman's Dark Tower Reading Guide. What you need to read, what you can skip, what is it all about? Here to tell you all about it, so let's hit it. Alright, today I'm going to talk about Stephen King's magnum opus, that being the Dark Tower series. If you're unfamiliar with it, or maybe you're familiar with Stephen King, the horror god, guru, not since H.P. Lovecraft has there been somebody so big in the genre of horror. Definitely the modern leader, bestseller guy. He sold more books than just about anyone other than like Tom Clancy and a few guys like that. And his output's amazing. He writes constantly. He has like 2 books a year, and they're not like tiny books. They're like, friggin' door stoppers. They're these giant things. And, he's not really the best known for, but among his hardcore fans, it's considered like, his ultimate work is the Dark Tower series. Now, there's more than just 8 books to this. That is the basic cycle, is about 8 books. But if you know anything about King, a lot of his other work ties in. He's always making little references to this or that. The Outlook Hotel from The Shining gets mentioned in Misery, or Derry and where it's at, and Castle Rock has a bunch of stuff, and both those towns are in the same world and they mention each other. Stuff like that. It's always coming up. So it's no surprise that Dark Tower also ties into it. And Dark Tower has deep tendrils in about everything he writes. So if you're new to King and you're just kind of overwhelmed, like you've heard well, all this ties in, I don't know where to start, I'm going to miss anything. First off, you can just read the basic 8 books and be fine. You're not missing a whole, nothing's going to be unexplained. But to get a better overall picture and just kind of get some, one of those people that like backstory, or just kind of want to get the whole thing, and you just haven't read a lot of King, or you just kind of read here and there with King and you're not really sure everything ties in. I'll give you what to read, what not to read. There's guys online, you can go and read all, even in the books themselves, there's like, if you read some of the Dark Tower books, they'll say in bold, like, connected to the Dark Tower. But in reality, you don't need to read all of them. Some are very tangent. It's still good, but, not needed for the story. Some are very important, but you wouldn't know it reading them sometimes. So, just going through the list, it's top to bottom. I found the list online. I think it's a good order, and I'll just tell you which ones, what's good about them, what to skip, blah, blah, blah. So, here we go. Number one, the Gunslinger. Got to start with the first. I mean, there's no better way to start, I think. The famous first words, the man in black fled across the desert, Gunslinger followed, starts off the book. It actually comes from a series he wrote for a men's magazine in the 70s. It was published monthly, and it was collected into this story. Now, if you know King's work, this one would be different for you. It is very differently written for him. It is very kind of western-y, with a bit of apocalyptic flair. Like, he was obviously watching a lot of spaghetti westerns, writing it, and reading some Lovecraft, and obviously in the poem that inspired it, Dark Child and the Gunslinger came by, I forget his name off the top of my head. I'll post it down there. But yeah, that all kinds of ties together, and you kind of see like a different side of King. It's a little bit different literary style for him. We meet Roland, we meet Jake, who he will be a bigger part of the story, even though it might not seem like it in the book. We meet the man in black. We meet Walter. We get his first backstory on him, how he became a man and went through the test to be a gunslinger, and that story will continue wrapping through the rest of the series. So, of course, better way to start off from the very first book. Book 2, again, going straight in order here. The Drawing of the Three. This list says you could put something in between them, but yeah, it continues right on. There's no real reason to get into a lot more backstory than what you get here. Book 2 is going to give you the rest of Roland's companions, the ties to our own world, different times. The characters who will become very important to the story. Obviously, his traveling companions. You're meeting them here. Find out what happens to him on the beach, and seeing how Roland, deals with our world versus his world, which has moved on, as they're constantly saying. Kind of gives a good juxtaposition, because if you don't The first book you kind of, realize like this world he's in is probably ours, like very, very long time afterwards. And it's falling apart, and that's kind of what he's doing. He's trying to save the world, the universe, basically, and find this Dark Tower. And his obsession kind of drags him to find the Man in Black to give him answers, and then we'll continue to drag him on now that he's found these people. My only problem with this book is the device by which he does draw his companions is never really explained. Someone said, like, if you actually read, there's a compendium, like it's like a Dark Tower appendix book somebody else wrote who keeps ridiculous copious notes with King. And it says that there actually does have an explanation in that, but in the book series themselves, it's never explained. It's just kind of there. And I was always kind of hoping to see, like, where the hell that came from, and they never explain it. But regardless, this is where the book really picks up. This one gets more King-like, but it's still kind of a little different. Where the first book is a little slower, kind of drawing you into a world and creating. This one's more of a King story, feels like. Definitely, obviously, if you're going to read you have to read it. It's one of the main books, so you have to read it if you're going to read The Dark Tower. Third book on the list, The Stand. Now, this is a monumental undertaking of itself. This list has it number 3. Do you need to read it for the story? No, necessarily. It definitely directly ties in. If you know The Stand by itself from the TV movie or you've read the book, yes, the main villain does come to play in the Dark Tower very largely. In fact, very soon, they will actually visit the world of The Stand. So the tie is there. But if you read The Stand, of course, The Stand is huge. It is 1,000 pages, and it doesn't have a whole, other than the one character, and the fact that they do visit this, it doesn't have a lot to do with the King world. But I will give it a recommendation just because it's one of King's best books of all time. If you haven't read it, just read it. If you're going through the Dark Tower, no problem. Go ahead and reread it and refamiliarize yourself with Mr. Flagg. And I can't say it's a wrong thing to do. Fourth book, The Eyes of the Dragon. Now here's one that's interesting because, again, not a direct book of the Dark Tower. It does take place somewhere in the Dark Tower world. I don't know when it was originally written. I don't know if that was supposed to be the case, but as it's later shown, it does. And in fact, the drawing of the 3 mentions an event that happens after the end of Eyes of the Dragon. So there's a direct tie, and in fact, the same villain shows up. This is a lot less known King book. It's a kind of medieval fantasy fairy tale kind of book, kind of weird, but it is part of the Dark Tower universe. I give it a slight nod just because it is a fun story, and Flagg's in it again, and you see another side of Flagg from what you saw on The Stand. Absolutely necessary reading material? No. But it's worth a read. Slight recommendation. Number 5, we're on another side book, The Talisman. This was co-written with Peter Straub when originally written, not a Dark Tower book, but if you've read it, even before you read the sequel, we'll get to, you'll kind of see there is kind of a weird parallel with the Dark Tower. And it's, parallel worlds, epic quest to go get something. In this case, it's the Talisman. It's a young boy named Jack. His adventures traveling between 2 worlds trying to save his mother. And eventually it is revealed where he goes. The territories is part of the Dark Tower world, mid-world, end-world, where Roland's at. That exists right there. And that gets more explained in the sequel when it directly ties the Talisman's world into the Dark Tower. I do agree this is a book you need to read just for background, because the sequel to it, The Black House, is, I think, recommended reading. So if you want background on that story, it's a good book to read. And it's a great book anyway. Absolutely necessary? No. If you feel like you just want to read The Black House and just pick up on it and skip it, you can do that. Because The Black House can stand on its own. It does. Obviously, it's a sequel. It'll reference the Talisman, but you don't have to read the Talisman to enjoy The Black House. But it's a good book, so slight recommendation. Book 6, we are back to the main story. This is Book 3, The Wastelands. This is where we kind of pick up back with Roland after the events on the beach and in our world, his new companions. We find out about the Path of Beam. We find these, what destroyed, you figure out what exactly destroyed the world back when. You see how that affected even, God knows, tens of thousands of years after the event. Probably not a big surprise. It was some kind of nuclear something, and that's the Wastelands. And it's how, the end of the tale it's twofold. It's Roland's losing his mind, and how he does it is kind of a weird tale, but pretty interesting. And then how they cross the Wastelands. If you were an original reader when these came out, this book was a huge cliffhanger because he wrote this in 1991. I think I read it about when it came out. I just got into King, and I read the first 2 books, and I read the third one pretty soon after it came out, and then I waited. I think I read it as a freshman in high school, and I was like 2 years into the Navy before the sequel, the next book, Book 4, came out. It's a long time to wait to find out what happened to Roland and his quartet. So reading these straight through won't be quite the chore it was for the rest of us, but of course, this is absolutely recommended reading. You have to read Book 3, obviously, and it's great. Great book. This list goes number 7, go right again, sticking right in the main storyline. Book 4, Wizard and Glass. Now here's, this actually doesn't move believe it or not, doesn't move the story forward very much. This is mostly a recollection of Roland's early days. In Book 1 you find out what happens when he passes test of manhood, and this book you find out what happened right after that, how he met his first love. And it sounds like, we're kind of going backwards for no reason. This story is super important to the rest of the story, believe it or not. And it's maybe one of my favorite books of all time, actually. It's my favorite Stephen King book. Best book of the Tower series, and I think one of the best books ever written in terms of it's basically a Western love story, and it's so good. And you got supernatural elements, of course, and little horror, crazy witch. You meet Roland's early companions, and one of his buddies is just this hilarious jokester. And it's just a fun book, sad, thrilling adventure. I think I've read it 5 times. Absolutely, of course, a recommendation. Not just part of the Dark Tower, but just as a good book in general. Number 8, Salem's Lot. This is what's going through me, just where they put it in order, because it is a book you need to read. But I honestly would have read it maybe earlier, just because if you've never read Salem's Lot, the part that's important to the story later, it's more fun to have a wait for it. Because I read this book, I think maybe the first Stephen King book I read as a freshman in high school, and then when it ties back into the Dark Tower was like 13 years later, and it was like a really nice surprise. So I think reading it earlier might be a better recommendation. So this list is putting it the 8th book to read. That's fine. You could actually read it first. Read it before you even read The Gunslinger. Not a bad idea. It's King's 2nd book ever in general, so it's kind of a way to just kind of see how his writing style evolves anyway. Overall, if you have to read this book, no. This one is losable, because even the character that becomes important in the story doesn't, what you need to know about him, he'll tell you in the rest of the book. So it's not necessary to read Salem's Lot. You might even not realize that guy's going to be important until you see him show up in the story. So not necessary to read, but if you're trying to get that overall big picture, an important character comes out of it, and kind of seeing where he comes from, it's not a bad idea. And it's a fun little haunted city story. It's real early King. It's kind of interesting to see where his style evolved rereading it. So if you've never read it, I don't think they ever made a movie out of it. It's just surprising. But definitely I give it a slight recommendation. This book goes on to a short story from Skeleton Crew called The Mist. They're basically the short story The Mist kind of ties into the last book of the main proper series. I don't recommend it. You don't need to. It's a short story though, so no big deal. Skeleton Crew itself is a fun little book of short stories, but I absolutely don't think you need to read it. But sure, if you want to, go ahead. Number 10 is It. Now, this is weird, but it does end up tying in stronger than you would think, other than just more of a tangent tie. I think most people probably know It, at least by the TV movie, with Tim Curry as Pennywise, which is just awesome. Fairly close to the book, more of the gruesome and, let's face it, icky aspects of the book taken out. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you'll read the end of the book, you'll know. And those who do know what I'm talking about are like, yeah, that happened, didn't it? Yeah, that happened in the book. Thankfully, not in the movie. But yes, the killer clown Pennywise from the It book is actually part of a larger story. It's actually just think of the turtle. The turtle's mentioned in It, and that does become part of the overall mythos of the Dark Tower, and it's very strongly tied in with It. Believe it or not, it's not a direct tie like the kids in Derry affect what's happening to Roland, but as terms of the mythos and arc of this world, it is very strong tie. Highly recommended as part of reading, understanding the series, and just reading the book itself. Especially if you only see the TV movie, it's very interesting to read the book and see the little differences.